Howdy, folks. Professor Jones here again. This will be the last lecture, the last slideshow, the last uh, topic before we get into the third unit test. I will send out an email and a Blackboard announcement about this so that you will have plenty of time to study for that. There's also going to be a couple of quizzes. We want to get through these through Unit 3 so we can get into Unit 4 and Unit 5, which will be muscles and nerves. There's a lot of interesting information, but it's pretty intense. On the flip side of that, this topic, joints, is if you're really good at memorization, if you like lists, this will be pretty good for you. And the study guide is pretty good. It's pretty easily laid out. And so let's get started with this. Let me hit the button that says, yeah, here we go. Right, so a joint is an articulation. A joint is where two bones meet. Two separate bones meet in a joint. Now, you're used to thinking of a joint as a moving thing. It may be able to move, it may not be able to move. It's still called a joint. There may be things in between the bones. Well, there's always something in between the bones. And there's something that's holding them together. What these somethings are can be different from joint to joint. But certainly we want stabilization at a joint. A joint is a funny thing. A joint is a mixture of a thing that should move and a thing that should be stable. So depending on the purpose of that particular joint, you either want it to be very stable and not move very much, or you want it to be pretty movable, but that means it's not very stable. And so most of the joints of the body are some sort of compromise between one and the other. And of course, they're referred to as articulations, as you see on the screen. Right? These are things that also will change over time. Typically, most joints, I can attest, most joints will become stiffer over time. Whatever the joint is, they tend to become less, if they were movable at one point, they're less movable later on. They do enable the body to move, right? So the joints that you're used to thinking of as joints, right? Your knee and your hip, your shoulder, those joints can move and they allow the body to move and they allow us to get from place to place. And that's a beautiful thing about joints, those kinds of joints. All right, where'd my mouse go? There we go. All right, next slide. So types of joints. We classify joints in two big different ways. Those two ways are here on the screen. We can either classify them structurally. Structurally means anatomically, or what are they made of? What are the tissues that are involved in that particular joint? Or we can classify them as functional joints. Functional means what do they do? Do they move a lot? Do they move at all? Do they move very little? So there are varying degrees of that. Now, the kind of joint, the structural classification of the joint, will influence the functional classification of the joint. It's not a perfect one-to-one balance, but certainly you're going to see some overlap in how joints, what they're made of, what they're constructed of, and what they can do. Can they move much? Do they not move much at all? Always think too, when you're talking about anatomy and physiology, you should be thinking about function. Why does this thing do what it's doing? You know, the joints are surrounding your brain, which are called sutures of the skull, and we're going to get into that in great detail. They should protect your brain. So, you know, they don't need to move a lot, if at all. On the other hand, you would like your hip and knee to be able to move pretty freely so that you can go from place to place. You can seek out food, you can go to work, you can do whatever it is that your body wants to do to move you around. So you should constantly be thinking about the function of that particular joint, and that will determine, at least in part, how it's made or what it's built of. Come on. Oh, there we go. Okay, first up, whoops, I got to move me. Fibrous joints. I don't know where I can put myself where I'm not in the way. Anyway, a fibrous joint is held together, dense connective tissue. When you talk about dense connective tissue, when you see that word, you should be thinking, yeah, they're not going to move a lot. Now, they do move some, but they don't move much. And so dense connective tissue. Collagen. Collagen is the preeminent and predominant protein of your body. It can be built in different ways, such that it will allow a little bit of movement, a little stretch, some elastic fibers in there, or it can be built where there's virtually no movement at all, that it's almost a rigid tissue, but not bony rigid. All right, so we categorize fibrous joints in three ways. Three kinds of fibrous joints, right? There's some weird words in here, and one of these words is one of my favorite words in all of anatomy and physiology. So syndesmosis, sutures, and here's my favorite, gomphosis. I love that word, gomphosis. Okay, we start with syndesmosis. A syndesmosis is a sheet of connective tissue that is very dense, very thick, and serves as kind of a flattened, elongated ligament of a sort. These things are found in between your radius and ulna in your forearm, and in between your tibia and fibula, as the example shows here. These are very dense sheets. They're called interosseous membranes. They bind together those two bones. Now, not bind them in such a way that they can't move, but they bind them pretty tightly. And so we consider the kind of movement that they allow as amphiarthrotic. This term down here, amphiarthrotic. Amphiarthrotic means there is some movement, a little bit of movement that's allowed, but not much. So, of course, you can twist your forearm back and forth, but of course the bones don't separate from one another. That's due in large part to this interosseous membrane, which is categorized as a syndesmosis. Yes, it's a joint. I know, it seems a little weird. These two bones that are next to each other, and the interosseous membrane forms a joint in between them. Right? So it's amphiarthrotic. It can move a little bit. There you go. Here's your classic examples. In fact, these are really the two best examples in the body, between the tibia and fibula and ulna and radius. All right, more fibrous joints. Sutures. These are in between the flat bones of the skull. This is a great picture. Oh gosh, I got to move me again. Wow, I don't know where to put myself now. Yikes. Right, so sutures. So the bones of the skull are individual bones. We've got the parietal bones, occipital bones, frontal bones, temporal bones. These are the bones of the cranium. These flat bones fit together. Oh, geez. Sorry. Went too far. These fit together. They fit together in very, very weird and intricate ways, almost like a meandering river. That's a suture. That suture will form a joint, right? It's because it's where one bone meets another bone, and they interlace, and they form a very tight bond in between there. There is no movement available. Now, there's some debate in my field of physical therapy, but for our purposes here and testing purposes, which is what you really care about, there is no movement. No movement in a joint means this, synarthrotic. Synarthrotic joint means it is an immovable joint. There's a thin layer of connective tissue called the sutural ligament that connects these two bones in this unusual meandering sort of joint surface. You can take these apart if you're very, very careful and you're good at it, and you'll end up getting something like this. You get this weird, jaggedy, edge-like end, and then, of course, the other side would be a match to that and would fit together very, very tightly. There's no movement there. My favorite, gomphosis. The gomphosis is a tooth in a socket in the jaw. Now, that can be in the mandible or the maxilla, but if the tooth is in a socket, this is a joint, and that joint is called a gomphosis. No movement, synarthrotic. So gomphoses are synarthrotic, they are not movable. Sutures are synarthrotic, they don't move. Let's move on. All right, next up, cartilaginous joints. Now, just by the term itself, you may be able to think or to imagine, well, it's cartilaginous. Chondrocytes make cartilage, and cartilage is a little bit more flexible. And so there's usually at least a little bit of movement in these kinds of joints. Or at least at first there's movement. The aging process can affect that process, that movement potential. First type here is called a synchondrosis. So look at the word. Syn simply means with, like synthesis, or you're putting things together. A chondrosis, you're putting things that have a cartilaginous type of membrane or attachment or cartilage between them. So, as it says, the bands of hyaline cartilage unite bones. Some of these are temporary. So, we talked about bones. We talked about the maturation of bones and how long bones get longer at the epiphyseal plate. The epiphyseal plate is considered a synchondrosis because it is formed by chondrocytes, and so it is cartilaginous while it's forming. But of course, at some point, the maturation process stops, the lengthening of that bone stops, and that epiphyseal plate turns into an epiphyseal line because it has ossified. Once it is ossified, then it's referred to as a synostosis. There is no movement there at all. Now you say a synchondrosis, the epiphyseal plate in this case, it shouldn't move. It's not designed to move, but it can shift a little bit. And in fact, there are diseases associated with too much shifting and too much movement between those. The other example here is between the manubrium and the first rib. And so remember the manubrium is the the upper part of the sternum comprised of these three bones, right? The xiphoid process down here, the body of the sternum here, and then the upper part of the sternum called the manubrium. Where the manubrium and the first rib meet, there is a cartilaginous attachment. In fact, there's a cartilaginous attachment between all of the true ribs and the sternum. But this one in particular is considered a permanent and synarthrotic joint. So in this particular case, there is no movement between the first rib and the manubrium at this costal cartilage. But it is considered a synchondrosis. All right. One more cartilaginous joint or cartilaginous joint type. This type is called a symphysis. Symphysis is formed when two bones approximate close to each other, and then in between them there is, in this particular case, there is a fibrocartilage padding. It's almost like a pad. It's very dense, it's very thick. Examples of these are the pubic symphysis between the two pubic bones in the front of the pelvis, and discs that are found in between vertebrae, so intervertebral discs. These do have some movement, very limited movement, so they are considered amphiarthrotic joints. So pubic symphysis and discs between the bodies of the vertebrae. The articular surfaces are covered by hyaline cartilage. So that means the bony surfaces are covered with hyaline cartilage, and then the pad of fibrocartilage is in between there. All right, now we get to joints where these are the kind of joints that you identify or you may think of as traditional kinds of joints. The knee, the hip, the shoulder, etc. Lots of joints. As you may suspect, since they are synovial joints and since they are the kind of joints that you think about when you think about joints of the body, they are joints that are referred to as diarthrotic. Diarthrotic joints are freely movable. Now, let me define that. Freely movable simply means that they can move in particular planes of motion freely. That doesn't mean they move in all planes of motions freely. Some joints do. Many joints move in one or two planes of motion. But they can move within those planes of motion. They move quite freely. We'll give you examples as we go along. All right, a synovial joint has these characteristics to it. Each of the joints, or each of the bones that make up the joint, are covered, the inner aspect where they meet the other bone is covered with what's called articular cartilage. And that is a very dense, but very, it's almost rubbery in its feel to it. It's a little harder than that, actually. But it's called articular cartilage. It serves as a friction-reducing surface between the two bones. In order to reduce the friction even further, there is this, the inside aspect of it, called the synovial membrane. And synovial membrane makes a fluid, and the fluid is called synovial fluid, thankfully. Synovial fluid is joint oil. I call it joint oil. It's the slippery stuff that allows synovial joints to move in their planes of motions without a lot of friction, at least when you're young. That changes. I think it's easier to show you a picture because, yes, there's an outer fibrous layer composed of ligaments. The inner layer is the synovial membrane, which secretes a synovial fluid. And that covers these bones that are part of the joint. Now, this consists of this whole thing, this whole structure that we refer to it as a joint capsule. So I'm going to show you a picture of that. So here we are. This is kind of a classic, nothing specific. That's not a specific joint. This is just kind of how a synovial joint is built. All right, so you have a bone, and you have a bone over here. The end of this bone and the end of that bone, right, they meet. They are covered with articular cartilage. Now, this is a little bit of a harder surface, but it's a smooth surface, quite a smooth surface. This one also has articular cartilage, okay? So they have this nice smooth surface where they meet. And then we add something else. We add a joint capsule. And the joint capsule has these two features where the outside of it is called the fibrous capsule, right? Ligaments. So when you think of ligaments, ligaments are part of a synovial joint, the synovial capsule, or the joint capsule. They provide the strength and the add to the solidarity of the joint so that it doesn't fly apart easily. On the inside of a fibrous capsule is a membrane lining it. This membrane is called the synovial membrane, and it is the thing that creates synovial fluid, the joint oil, if you will. This slippery joint fluid lubricates the whole joint and allows these two articular cartilage layers to slide freely past each other. So you get good, easy movement. You also get stability from the joint capsule. All right, so here's the bits and pieces that you need to have a synovial joint. You need articular cartilage, check. Joint capsule, check. And the two layers of the joint capsule is the fibrous capsule on the outside, and you have the synovial membrane on the inside, and that's what we get to. Ligaments and synovial membrane, check and check. They have a synovial cavity, right? So this is the cavity, the opening, if you will, in between the two bones and lying between the articular cartilage, and that cavity is filled with synovial fluid. All right, there's your synovial joint. Now, in addition to that, at some synovial joints, you will see these other things. You will see a meniscus or a menisci. Menisci is the plural form. Knee joints are classic for this, where you have a meniscus. And a meniscus is an enhancement built on top of the articular cartilage that helps to guide one bone one bone's movement against the other bone. Again, the knee is kind of a classic example of this. You will have meniscus. You have a lateral and medial meniscus that guides the femoral condyles in their movement on top of the tibia. So meniscus helps to guide that and helps to add to a kind of a padding layer or a cushioning layer, if you will. And then some joints, many joints, have what's called a bursa or bursae. Bursae is the plural form. Bursa is I call it a slippery disc. It has synovial fluid inside it, and it acts as a barrier or a friction reducer between a tendon and a bone. Right? Again, the knee is a classic example of this, where the patellar tendon will come and attach to the tibia, the tibial tuberosity, and underneath that tendon is a bursa that helps to reduce the friction between the tibia and the tendon. If there were nothing like that there, you would get a lot of friction in between there. You would get a lot of irritation, a lot of pain, a lot of inflammation and swelling. That still sometimes happens, but the bursa can mitigate a lot of that. So here it is. Here's the classic example. Okay, so this is the distal femur, and you can see the epiphyseal line. So this person, this has ossified. So they are not an adolescent. They're an adult, whoever this is. Here's a tibia. Tibia also has the epiphyseal line that is ossified. This is the femoral condyle covered with articular cartilage. Here's the tibial plateau covered with articular cartilage. Great. We have our synovial. The blue thing is the synovial membrane that creates synovial fluid, the slippery joint oil stuff. All right, so that forms this nice slick fluid, and that allows this joint to move easily. Here's a meniscus. Now this meniscus is cut in half. You can't, because we've cut the femur in half, we've cut the tibia in half, so we've cut the meniscus in half. Really, this thing would have a kind of a horseshoe shape to it if you looked at it from above. But of course it looks like two separate things from this view. And that makes the tibia a better surface for the femur to move in or rest on. Of course, no knee would be complete without a patella. That's just basically a floating bone held within the patellar or within the quadricep tendon. And it also has articular cartilage, and it rides up against the femur. Here's the patellar tendon that comes down, attaches to the anterior surface of the tibia, and then you have a bursa there to reduce friction. You have a bursa. Now the knee has a lot of bursa. You have a bursa in front of the knee to reduce friction between the skin and the patella, where when you're moving your knee back and forth a lot, you're going to get a lot of friction between the skin and the patella. You want to reduce that friction. You have a bursa. So these are all the component pieces of certainly the knee joint. Now, all right, we have, holy Toledo, I gotta move me. Where am I gonna move me from? I'll move me over here this time. Yikes. Get out of the way, Mike. There are 6 different types of synovial joints. Yes, you need to understand these. Now, these are classified, typically or generally speaking, classified by how much movement they allow, or the range of motion that they allow, or the kinds of motions that they allow. So we start off with the one that is most freely moving. Now, remember, these are all diarthroidal joints. A diarthrosis is freely moving, but remember I specified it's freely moving in a particular plane, or maybe multiple planes, but it is restricted by the shape of the joint, by how the surfaces fit together, and by other structures around that joint may limit that motion. One of the most movable, well, the most movable of all of the synovial joints is called the ball and socket joint. sometimes called a spheroidal joint. It's your classic ball in socket, right? So you got the ball, it's inside the socket. That thing can move in 3 planes of motion. It can move in x-axis, y-axis, and z-axis. Or in human terms, what we call that, we say it can move in the sagittal plane. It can move forward and backward. It can move in the frontal plane or the coronal plane. That's side to side. And it can move in the transverse plane. That's twisting motions. Hips are great examples of that. They can do all those things. We say they're multi-axial, 3 planes of motion. Your hip and shoulder are really the best examples there. And the only ones you're really going to be tested on in terms of ball and socket movement. Next up, condylar joints. Condylar joints can move in 2 planes of motion. An interesting example of this is, you have them right here, your what's called the metacarpophalangeal joint, the MCP in your hands. You have MTPs, metatarsophalangeal joints in your toes that do the same thing. It's easier to see it in the hands. So if I hold this one finger up, I can move that finger at this joint. I can move it this way. I can point at me. Mike, yes. And I can do this. I can say, That's a no-no. You shouldn't do that. So that is the 2 planes of motion. I cannot twist my finger. I mean, I can grab it and twist it, but I can't move it in a twisting motion. So there are 2 planes of motion. This way, flexion, extension, and this way, side-to-side motion here. Right? So we call that a condylar joint. It's sometimes called an ellipsoidal joint, but it still limits the movement into 2 planes of motion. So we say those joints are biaxial. Now this one's multi-axial. That you could really translate that into triaxial. 3 planes of motions. Biaxial means 2 planes of motions. There's no rotation. That is a condylar joint. Next up, a plane joint. Plane, P-L-A-N-E, plane, as in flat. It's a flat joint. A flat joint is also called a gliding joint. So a plane or a gliding joint are the same thing. They're almost flat. They're never actually, like, you never have 2 like bricks in your body that do this. But you can imagine, especially the carpal bones, the wrist bones, they have a slight curvature to them, but basically they just slide past each other. They don't really move in a very defined way. They just slide or glide. We say they glide next to each other. So that's called a plane joint. Wrists and ankles. This is also, there isn't a particular plane that they move in, that any of these joints move in. So we don't consider it an axial movement at all. There's no axis that is defined where these joints move. They are non-axial. Yes, they can move. Yes, they can move sometimes in multiple ways, but they're not defined by planes, which I know is, I've hammered that into your head that, we all have these 3 planes of motion, and now I'm telling you, this one does whatever it wants to. But we consider it just a back and forth motion. There's no twisting involved here. It's non-axial. Wrist and ankle. Carpals and tarsals. Those are your ankle bones. All right, hinge joint. Hinge joint is exactly that. It's a hinge. It moves like a door hinge. A door hinge can move in one direction, right? It can open and it can close. That's it. We consider that 1 plane of motion. Your elbow is a perfect example of this. It's a hinge joint. It's considered uniaxial. Uni, meaning 1. There is 1 plane of motion. Your elbow can extend and flex, and that's it. It can't do anything else because of the shape of the joint. Shape of the joint is this surface. It's a hinge. It doesn't allow any other motions. Now we also consider the joint between the femur and the tibia. Now that's not a knee. The knee would include the patella. But bear with me here. Where the tibia and fibula, or femur, meet, what we might call it the tibial joint. I'm sorry, the femoral tibial joint. Ugh, listen to me. Where they meet, there is a primary motion, and we call the knee a hinge joint. We consider the knee a hinge joint. Now, there are some other what we call accessory movements in the knee, but by and large, the knee is a hinge joint as well. But the classic example of a hinge joint is the elbow, because that's all it can do. Now, the joints between your phalanges. What are phalanges? Phalanges are the rest of the finger. Right, here's the start. I already told you that's a biaxial that can move in two ways. But this joint, it can do this. This joint can do the same thing, except I can't do it individually. I'm not that good. So that's also a hinge joint. That's it. One uniaxial, one axis of movement. Next up, pivots, pivot joints. Pivot joints also have one axis of movement, but the axis of movement is different than your finger. Your finger is no rotation. The pivot joint, the classic example here, is between your upper two cervical vertebrae, C1 and C2. There is a point. Hi, my puppy wants to play. You're gonna have to wait, buddy. Between the first and second cervical vertebrae, there is a joint, and that joint is a uniaxial joint, and it allows rotation only. So that would look like, that's like you saying no. When you do this, when you say no, that's what I'm saying to my dog right now. No, buddy, can't play. That is a uniaxial motion. That is a pivot joint that's caused between the first two cervical vertebrae, or what are also known as the axis and the atlas. The atlas is the highest cervical vertebrae. The axis is the second cervical vertebrae, and they move. One of the motions between them is this pivot motion. Saddle joint. Saddle joint's next. Saddle joint, your thumb. Your thumb can move in this direction. It can move in this direction. And it can move in this direction. Now, oddly, we consider that a biaxial movement. It can move in two different planes of motion. We can combine those two planes into that fun motion that's called a circumduction. But we consider it a biaxial movement, two planes of movement. The thumb. Now the saddle joint. Now what we're talking about is the joint between the first metacarpal and the bone called the trapezium in the wrist. Where they meet, they form this kind of saddle-like shape to them, and they can move in those two planes of motion. All right, lifespan changes. Of course, there are changes in joint movement. As I mentioned right at the beginning, joints typically become stiffer. They become less mobile with age. So I would highly recommend that you try to maintain as much movement as you can over time. Try to keep that movement. Whatever you have, try to keep it, or you can try to enhance it as time goes on. Stretching exercises, basic general movement exercises. Diarthrotic joints are subject to arthritis. Arthritis means an inflammation of a synovial joint. As arthritis increases, articular cartilage tends to wear out or gets kind of decimated, dehydrated. It makes those surfaces less smooth, and they tend to catch and not move as smoothly. I guess maybe that's just maybe the quick way of saying that. Fibrous joints can change. They strengthen. Well, they weren't very, if they were mobile at all, they weren't very mobile, and now they're less mobile. The cartilage in synchondroses stiffens. As I said, things become less mobile over time. Ligaments lose elasticity. Sorry to be a broken record here, but yes, less movement, less flexibility, less elasticity. Changes in symphysis joints of the vertebral column diminish flexibility and decrease height. Right? So discs that were between the vertebral bodies tend to shrink. They get less tall, so there is less space between the vertebrae, and that is part of what we measure when we measure height. So you get shorter. Synovial joints lose function. They don't have a very good capillary supply to begin with. They have less capillary supply as they age. Disuse is another way. This is something that I would tell patients all the time, or I still tell patients, is the best way to make your joints worse and age more rapidly is to not use them. A used joint will maintain its hydration, its nutrition status, its thickness, its synovial fluid flow much better if you use the joint, if you work the joint. If you don't work it, it will do what muscles do, right? Muscles atrophy if you don't use them. Joints do a similar kind of thing. We don't call it atrophy, but it's the same kind of thing. They become less mobile. Activity and exercise keeps joints functioning longer. There's no question about this. The research is clear over and over and over again. All research studies at every age. We have researched kids who are 5, 10, 15 years old. We've researched what are known as, one of my favorite descriptions of elderly people. People who are 85 years old and older are called the oldest old in research literature. Well, you can complain all you want about the terminology, but that's the way it is. Yes, the oldest old actually get more flexible and stronger if they engage in activity and exercise. It's not complicated. All right, now the rest of the slides get into how we define specific motions. Now this is not a class where I'm worried about you understanding specific motions. I know in lab you get into that a lot more. I do want to just help you to brush up on the specific kinds of motions and what the names of these movements are and what muscles can perform what movements. So just kind of a brief overview here. So first off, if a joint can move at all, remember to review, it's where a bone meets a bone. If a bone meets a bone, that is a joint. What kind of joint and what that joint can do depends. Now, if it's meant to move around, like a synovial joint, you're going to have a muscle around that joint. That muscle, or those muscles, plural, will be designed to move the joint in the directions that the joint can go. We consider one end of the muscle as the origin. Now, I have my own issues with this terminology, but I'll stick to the traditional terminology. The origin is the less movable end. We used to say the origin is the fixed end. Well, there's no muscle that's fixed in your body that doesn't depend on some other muscle to hold that attachment point still. However, the less movable end, we refer to that as the origin. The more movable end is considered the insertion. All right, so again, easy example, your elbow, right? Your bicep brachii, well, and brachialis too, but bicep brachii is attached to the radial tuberosity down here beyond your elbow. And the rest of the muscle is attached up here in your shoulder. I won't get into the specific places where it's attached, but it's attached up here. So when the origin, which would be the less movable end, or the relatively fixed end, when that area we call that the origin, when this muscle contracts, it will pull on the insertion. And when it pulls on the insertion, down here, my elbow bends in a certain way. And the certain way that it bends is called flexion. Right? So when the biceps brachii muscle that has its origin here near the shoulder and its insertion beyond my elbow when it contracts, we're going to learn all about contraction. When it contracts, it is going to bend my elbow. That elbow movement is called flexion. So we say the action of bicep brachii is elbow flexion. That's what we call that. All right, so these are the kinds of movements, some of the kind of movements that you can get. I already showed you the elbow. The elbow can flex and extend. Remember, that is a uniaxial joint. So the joint can only go in one plane of movement. And so the muscles around that joint will be able to move that joint in one plane of movement. Uniaxial. Now it's still a diarthrital joint. It's still a synovial joint. So you can categorize these joints in many different ways. And I guarantee you the questions that you're going to see on the test are going to be designed to elicit responses like that. Now, these terms, the terms abduction and adduction, think of add, the word add, right? ADD. If I'm adding something, I'm bringing it together. Well, when you adduct some part of your body, you are bringing it back to the rest of the body. So the shoulder adduction is bringing the arm into the rest of the body. Hip adduction is bringing that leg back to the rest of the body, closer to the rest of the body. The opposite of that is abduction. That means moving the arm or the leg away from the center of the body. So that's ab. Now, I point this out to a lot of students. This is one letter difference. If you make a mistake between abduction and adduction, you are wrong. Yes, it's one letter. It's going to drive you crazy, but it's a very, very important letter. So make sure you don't make a mistake with those letters. Make sure they're legible. If you have to type them, make sure you type the right letter. If you have to write them down, make sure you write a B that looks like a B and a D that looks like a D. It's extremely important. So here are the other motions. We can generally, and here are other motions that joints can do. I'm not going to get into the specifics of this. I'm not going to test you on your ability to decide what inversion and eversion or protraction and retraction is. These are great things to study and learn about. I'm sure you have to do it in lab. Now, this is examples of synovial joints, but you know there's lots of synovial joints in your body. These are certainly, if I were to ask you a question about the shoulder, you would say, well, it's a multi-axial or a triaxial joint. It can move in 3 planes of motions. It's a synovial joint. It's diarthrotic. It has a synovial membrane. It has articular cartilage. I mean, all of that stuff. Now, a big difference here, of course, is the shoulder can move in 3 planes. The hip can move in 3 different planes of motion, but the elbow is uniaxial. Uniaxial, and the knee is, we consider it a uniaxial joint for the most part. It flexes and extends. Whereas the hip and shoulder, they're more similar in that way, that they can move in 3 planes of motion. There's a drawing of a shoulder and all the bits and pieces around the shoulder. I'm not going to test you on whether you know it's a glenoid cavity, the head of the humerus, all that kind of stuff. That's more of a lab thing. It's just good to be able to look at this. Things I might test you on, if I had a picture like this, say for example, I would say, well, what's this line represent? Well, that represents the ossification of the epiphyseal plate. I might ask you, is this a child or is this somebody, is this person more likely to be 10 years old or 30 years old? Of course, your answer has to be 30 years old because you see the union, the ossification of the epiphyseal plate. Now, I know that's not what this picture is all about, but those are the kinds of things that I might test in lecture. Here's a great, this is a cadaver that has been uh, sawed, sawed off to show you all of the bits and pieces of a real cadaver shoulder joint. The other thing that I'm pretty picky about joints, a joint, a joint must, a bone, where a bone meets a bone is a joint. You must have two bones that meet each other in order to form a joint. Otherwise, you don't have a joint. You have a bone and a bone. They have to, when they're together, they form a joint, and then that joint may have certain characteristics that we've gone through. If they are not together, they are not a joint. So, what a specific example, this picture shows you the shoulder joint. Great. This picture does not show you a shoulder joint. It shows you the scapula and the glenoid cavity and all of the particulars of the scapula, but you're missing the humerus. If you don't have a humerus and a humeral head, you don't have a joint. You have a scapula. All right, my computer is going to die. That's all I really wanted to cover here. You don't need to know these specific ligaments for the lecture test. I will close this out now, say goodbye, and I will send you some announcements to let you know what's coming up and what you got to do after break. Thanks a lot for your attention. See you later.